Okay, good. So welcome everybody, whether you're here in Philadelphia or zooming in from points unknown to this, the sixth session of the Spring 24 workshops in the history of material texts. I'm Jerry Singerman, Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with John Pollock, over there, Curator for Research Services at the Gislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, and Zachary Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, who's been called away on an urgent family birthday party. So we regret his absence, but we have checked it out, and the excuse does seem to be a legitimate one. So, now, present as always is Lila Goldenberg of the Penn History Department and the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. And present too is Peter Stallybrass, the person without whom none of us would be in this room or in this particular Zoom meeting at this time. For it is Peter, of course, who founded the workshop, as we never cease to show our pride, amazing 31 years ago.
And Jessica Linker says she can hear you laughing online.
Okay, and I will say that when Peter is absent, many of us actually hear his voice in our heads and find ourselves channeling his questions. And to tell the truth, this can get a little spooky. So it's much less weird and immensely more interesting when Peter is actually here. So we're delighted. A few familiar housekeeping matters. For those of you who are in the room, we ask that you sign the attendance sheet that Lila is circulating, and if you're not already on the listserv, would like to be that you add your email address. Also, in consideration of remote attendees, and this never works, but I ask it every week, we ask that when the time comes for discussion, really do try to speak more loudly than you might think necessary, so that your voice may be audible to our remote participants who, have to hear you through that little plastic triangle. For those of you who are joining us remotely, please do mute yourselves during the talk, of course, but make yourselves known by using the chat function, which Lila will be curating. And during the Q&A, please raise the hand function so that we may call upon you and ask you to unmute yourselves then. Now, I remind everyone that in observance of Penn's spring break, there will be no seminar next Monday, but that we will reconvene 2 weeks from today on March 11th at 5:30 for the first of Elizabeth McHenry's ASW Rosenbach lectures toward a history of Black print, with the second and third following on that Tuesday and Thursday, respectively. So please, everybody, do come. Pre-registration is encouraged, though not essential. But now to matters at hand. Now, it's undeniable that over the long course of this workshop's history, presentations have been heavily weighted toward Anglophone and Western European and temporally situated from the Middle Ages onward. This has certainly not been a matter of design, but probably a factor of where the organizers' networks mostly reach. But we do try to diversify, and with some measure of success, I hope. Now, several years back, my memory is that I asked Joe Farrell what we might do to beef up our coverage of Greco-Roman antiquity, and his answer really can be boiled down to 3 words, which were invite Joe Howley. So we did, and Joe Farrell was, as usual, quite right, because Joe Howley gave a splendid and really quite memorable presentation on the scribal role of slaves in ancient Rome. This year, we thought of inviting Joe Howley all on our own, and I'm delighted to welcome him back. So Joe earned his undergraduate degree at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, his MLit in ancient history from the University of St. Andrews, and his PhD in classics from that same institution. He's currently Associate Professor of Classics at Columbia University, where he's also Paul Brook Program Director Chair for Literature Humanities, which is a big deal, I think. Yeah,
they tell me.
Yeah. Extramurally, he is a Senior Fellow in Critical Bibliography at Rare Book School. He's the founding co-chair of Columbia's Seminar on Material Texts, one of our many worthy imitators. And he's served as co-organizer of the annual Materia, New Approaches to Material Text in the Ancient World Symposium. He has published in the journals Arethusa, PMLA, the Journal of Roman Studies, and in various edited collections, a remarkable preponderance of them coming from Oxford University Press. And he's published on topics really ranging from book burning in ancient Rome to early 20th century recordings of ancient Greek literature, Greek and Latin. He's the author of Aulus Gellius and Roman Reading Culture, Text, Presence, and Imperial Knowledge in the Noctes Atticae, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. He's co-editing with Jeremiah Coogan and Candida Moss a forthcoming Writing and Power in the Roman Mediterranean, which is going to be published by Oxford. And he is currently writing a book on the role of enslaved laborers in Roman book culture. This evening, he promises to unsettle many of our assumptions about the materials and tools with which ancient Romans wrote, and the surfaces, erasable or not, on which they did so. So please join me now in welcoming Joe Howley, who shall steer us, we hope, actually I'm quite sure, toward a new typology of Roman writing equipment.
Awesome. Thank you all for such a warm welcome, Jerry. Thank you for such a generous introduction. Thank you for having me back here. I mean, sincerely, this is this, and by this I mean Philadelphia, University of Pennsylvania, this room. These are like happy places for me. I'm so much good work that I admire and respect and appreciate goes on here. I've had so many good times here. I really value every opportunity to be in this space, and I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity to present this work. I'm almost reluctant to call it work for reasons I'll explain here in this setting. I'm going to see if I can make, no offense, I'm going to see if I can make everyone a little smaller on the side of this. I can, but the cursor seems to have gone walkabout. So let's see what I'm saying. Hold on a second. It's okay. We've all only been doing this for who knows how many years. There we go. And I'm even gonna, I think I can hide this guy here. Yeah, hide floating meeting controls. Check that out. Okay. I have been practicing in both my teaching and my presentation of research, taking a different approach than the one in which I was trained, which is to say not reading from a script. And I hope that that will not be a terrible mistake in your view or in mine. I'm going to be talking from slides. I'd also say that when I received the extraordinarily welcome introduction or invitation to speak to this group again, I quickly zeroed in on a part of my bigger project and interests that is less finished, precisely because I know that this is the body to help me figure out where I'm going or whether I'm headed in the right direction. And so I really value the opportunity to get so many book historians and material text people and classicists to weigh in on this work at this particular stage. And I hope that you will find something of value in it. I mean, I think I have something like an argument today, but we'll see. And I have basically tried to not tighten the screws all the way down, if you see what I mean. So we'll see where that takes us. I wish I had the sort of the like self-confidence or chutzpah to start literally just saying previously on my own scholarship, but I actually do. I am going to quote myself just a little bit because I think that this project or the work I'm talking about today is actually picking up from where I ended an article on book burning that I published in 2017. In that article, I was trying to I argued that we can only make sense of Roman practices of literary book burning by understanding them alongside Roman practices of documentary book burning, which seem to be more common, better understood, better documented. And I used this to sort of argue for a more capacious sort of book historical understanding of Roman material text, and one that both adumbrates the literary and the documentary together, but that also tries to ask the sources, what did the Romans think these things were, rather than applying modern categories and assumptions. And I think that book history, as I understand it, has just an enormous amount to teach the study of ancient Rome in this regard. What I'm going to zero in on today are questions of translation, identification, categorization, In other words, there's words and objects that we encounter in Roman discussions of writing. And I'm going to suggest that we should rethink how we understand what those words mean and the connotations of them. It's not going to be a philological argument per se, but this is the question of like how we translate the word for tablets, for example, is sort of something that's going to keep coming up over and over. The question of the tablet. Well, as some of you know, the tablet is an old problem in the study of ancient literature. Famously, the earliest reference to the technology of writing in Greek literature is in Book 6 of Homer's Iliad, and this is the only reference in Homeric Greek to the technology of writing, and so we actually cannot say if this is a weird way to talk about writing or not. But very famously in Book 6 of the Iliad, the hero Bellerophon is recalled to have been given these tablets that have, they seem to be tablets that seem to have a kind of, you know, Hamlet style, like his own death warrant contained within them, and he unwittingly carries them. And, you know, with Peter Stallybrass in the room, I don't have to talk too much, I think, about, you know, tablets and the sort of long history of tablets in the modern book, and tablets as a phenomenon. I think of the tablet, the erasable tablet, as sort of one of the ways that in the study of the kind of modern book, medieval into the modern book, we can crack open assumptions about what writing is and what text is, what people use books for. Well, I want to start here by suggesting that even for the Romans, this was a problem, and this was that tablets were a way that they could ask this question. So I'm going to move now from Homer and, you know, the question mark century, 8th century, let's call it BCE, this strange early reference to writing, to the Roman encyclopedist Pliny the Elder, who looked back at this episode in the Iliad and tried to square it with his understanding of the technological and cultural history of the Mediterranean. A strange thing to say Egypt did not yet exist, but Pliny thinks papyrus comes from Egypt, and he reads Homer and sees in Homer's folded tablets a reference to wooden tablets, and he thinks, well, you know, way back then they must not have had papyrus. Otherwise, Bellerophon would have been given a papyrus letter, a folded bit of papyrus to carry this document in. The fact that Bellerophon in Homer, or the fact that Homer talks about folded tablets, must mean that people didn't have access to papyrus. So just the tablet is already, for a Roman historian, working at great historical distance and also cultural removes, is a way of trying to reconcile the book historical gulf between the present and the past. And I find this interesting. If you are interested in sort of pre-modern books and you haven't yet spent time with Book 13 of Pliny the Elder, the discussion of papyrus in there is completely fascinating. The market for papyrus, the production of papyrus. This is just one example where he gets into the ancient history of papyrus and has a great litany of examples of really long survival times for papyrus and what he thinks that means for the nature of human memory. So I commend this bit of Pliny to you. So a tablet is, I think, a productive focus for the big question I'm interested in today, which is how should we describe and categorize and think about Roman writing equipment across different time and space and biomes? I'll say more about what I mean by biomes in a minute. But is it possible to do this in a way that successfully adumbrates both literary and non-literary uses of writing? So I find that I am attracted to what I've come to think of as elephant in the dark room type problems, right? Where you have a kind of big phenomenon and everyone's reaching out and grabbing a certain part of it and no one is quite talking about the same thing. If you just turn on the light, you could realize that we were just looking at an elephant. Everyone following me? The elephant analogy? Okay. And so as I alluded to in my précis for the talk, I think that Roman writing is one of these. We have such disparate kinds and collections of evidence for such apparently different kinds of practices that I don't think we yet have a totalizing account of Roman writing. And we could think about whether that's something we want to have, but I think that the project of trying to come to one is interesting. So I'm going to try to do it. Here I'm in part influenced by a question that's often on my mind as a Romanist and book historian who's learned a great deal from book historians of other time periods. I'm interested in the question of how transhistorical and longue durée and comparatist approaches to book history can kind of flatten the particulars of book cultures, right? When we zoom out far enough, we find ourselves wanting to periodize in technological and material terms and say, well, you know, this is manuscript and this is print, or this is scroll and this is codex. And I think this important article from a few years back from Book History about silent reading points us to some cautionary tales about the way that ancient books and reading have been kind of simplified in order to serve a kind of Whig history of the book in Europe. And I think that that just sort of gives us license to go back and rethink assumptions about antiquity where the categorizations are broad, or the descriptions are broad. Equally, I'm interested in the sort of imperial cultural history problem of thinking about Roman as a category that describes an enormous swath of both space and time. And so on the one hand, there are Romans living and writing in very different parts of the European and Mediterranean world at different times. And yet we do also see across these times and places similar textual practices going on. In fact, it seems to be one of the features of Roman hegemonic cultural imperialism that particular literate practices are translated around the imperial world, in some cases intersecting with local textual cultures, but also being sort of transmitted as a phenomenon of empire. So then the question is, well, what if you zoom out far enough, does it make sense to talk about a bunch of different things or people or places as Roman? That's a kind of a Romanist question that I'm interested in, but I think it's a sort of x-axis version of the y-axis version about what big picture book history does to the particulars of book cultures. So I'm going to try to sort of illustrate today that there is not in Roman writing a one-to-one correspondence between any specific kinds of writing practice and any particular medium, support, or format. It is simply not possible in the Roman world to say that this one format of material is exclusively associated with this one kind of writing. It's not even possible to say Romans use wax for notebooks because wax is erasable, without then also having to say, well, Romans use wax for archival storage because wax is permanent. Okay? So use and material alone do not correlate. So how do we make big generalizations? I want to suggest and explore the possibility of that we could use affordance as the key to these relationships between medium and practice in Roman writing. So we should look at the media and forms involved in Roman writing and ask what those material substances allowed Roman users to do with their writing. And then we should look at the kinds of writing that Romans engaged with and ask what did they need from their tools in order to achieve those purposes. Okay. And so I'm going to suggest that affordance is the bridge here. I'm using affordance in a very literal, under-interrogated sense. It's just like the basic sense of what do materials let you do with them. Part of how we're going to proceed then has to do with the problem of literature, which is something I'm very interested in. I think that the process of becoming a book historian for me has also been the process of unlearning a great deal of epistemic baggage and bias that I acquired as part of my training as a literary scholar. Training I'm very grateful for, which is I've come to understand the more I've expanded the category of the book in my own understanding, the more I've come to understand how the literary sort of shaped my assumptions. In the study of ancient Rome, compared to other book history fields, we are far more dependent on literary evidence for book culture because of the material survival rate being so much worse than, say, medieval or early modern European books. So the literary is a problem because we are dependent on literature, so we have to handle it with care. And also, as a field, we have disciplinary biases towards literary literacy as a thing that our sources describe. So the Roman tablet as a thing a poet uses to compose literature is kind of extensively explored in scholarship on Roman literature. And the tablet as an archival form of documentary storage is, I think, generally underexplored, relatively speaking, because we're literature people, and so we're interested in the literature, okay, and what the literature says about literature. So what does it mean to read literary accounts of documentary literacy? What does it mean to read documents in the material record? And what does it mean to read tools of writing in the material record? Press the wrong button. Okay, I'm going to do the Roman tablet and 3 objects is how I'm going to proceed with this. I've got 3 tablets. I want to look at them. I want to think about the questions that they ask. I've got Verruchius's tablet from Cicero's Verines. I've got Persius's parchment notebook from his satires, and I've got memorial stele of a guy called Numerius from modern day Turkey. I am, apologies to the classicists in the room, I am not going to kind of go deep on the classical context of these, so if you'll forgive me, but I'm very happy to talk about them in the discussion. In terms of the sort of literary context of these, I'm going to sort of jump in and out. But I think each of these objects cracks open a kind of fault line in our modern assumptions and associations and categorizations about what a tablet is and the relationship between materiality and function in Roman tablets. I want to just gesture first to some kind of conventional narratives, I think, of the book in Rome and how the tablet fits into them. So our kind of conventional narrative of how literature is produced is that like an author writes or dictates, and that drafting work is done on a tablet, and then that's copied off the tablet into a book roll. Similarly, our conventional process of understanding documentary handling, they may be dictated, they may be recorded through other kinds of processes, but the documents are often generated on an intermediate tablet or ostraca, something like that. Ostraca or potsherds, they're often used as sort of notebook or temporary writing surfaces. And at some point, those like receipts or day books are kind of copied into a larger, more permanent format, whether it's sort of more stable tablets or book rolls, something like that. So that's the sort of like lateral tablet sitting in the middle of a process. The tablet is never where things finish, really, in those conventional narratives. And then in our history of the Mediterranean European book, the tablet is also sort of like prior to some inevitable fulfillment. Right, so that like the tablet is the precursor to the scroll, the precursor to the codex, although of course now we are all mindful that the codex in fact comes from the tablet in important ways. We also have this idea of sort of a development of forms that we go from wood to papyrus to parchment. All right, I'm just gesturing loosely to these, and I'm aware that these are arguably sort of straw men, but I think these are like loose assumptions that associations that we have that we find in scholarship and in big picture narratives. I want to be mindful of what the tablet is and how it fits into this stuff. I just want to gesture here to some important recent studies on these topics that have been reference points for me. In particular, I want to point to Elizabeth Meyer's 2004 book on the legal situation of documentary tablets in Rome. I think like if you're interested in Roman tablets and your primary association is with the drafting of poetry, this is a real like mind-bending book. And I also, Benjamin Hartman's 2020 book on the scribes of Rome is a very important cultural study of literacy and social status at Rome. But the title on here that will do the least to advertise to you how interesting it is Howlett Eckert's 2017 Writing and Power in the Roman World, Literacies and Material Culture. The title of this book should have been The Roman Inkwell, because it is a comprehensive survey of all archaeological records of inkwells in the Roman world. And to my knowledge, no one had ever done this before. And this is a completely kind of orthogonal way into the material record of Roman writing and raises super interesting questions about ink and how we can think about ink and its role in Roman writing. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. I reviewed this book, and I'm pretty sure that I said something very specifically wrong in there. But maybe I'll come back to that later. I'm still thinking about this book and its implications. What's my argument? Okay, my argument is going to be about erasability. I think that if we think about erasability as the primary need for certain writing practices, and erasability as an affordance of certain materials, then we can find a way into a more systematic kind of typology and categorization. So using the tablet as my focus, I'm going to argue that we tend to overestimate the temporariness of the waxed tablet. We tend to underestimate the role of parchment in Roman writing, and that we miss the presence of writing at gradients of status and power. We miss the multi-party nature of Roman literate acts across these gradients. And this gets back into what I was talking about the last time I was here in my ongoing book project about slavery. We'll start with Verrucius's tablet. This is the literae in the litura, the writing in the erasure. So the tablet in Roman literature, and there's a translation problem here, but here I'm referring to the tabellae, the little tablets. These are typically understood in Roman Latin literature as site of ephemera, personal correspondence, drafts, something you would erase when you're done. They are in Roman literature the predominant material poetic image of composition and authorship. When a Roman poet wants to describe himself at work, he uses the image of the tablet. The tablet is where you draft. Okay. And then just some pictures here. I was in Naples a few months ago and got to see some of these frescoes in person. And so this is one of my own pictures. I think actually we could think a lot about whether this is, I don't think this is meant to be a literary tablet, but you see this object in the middle on the lower shelf. That's a set of wax tablets. We have a specimen here. You can see this is multi-leaved and has most notably a little stud in the middle to keep the wax from getting smushed onto the opposite page when they're closed. And you can see next to it the book roll, the scroll with the inkwell and the pen. In fact, I think what you actually have here reading from right to left is like the day book or the slate for like brief note taking, the tablet for sort of assembling your materials, the scroll for finally recording or assembling them in some way. But this is all probably more business related than literary, which I construe from the giant piles of money. I'm a very sophisticated reader of visual. There's two kinds of tablets, though. There's these tabelli, these handheld and personal notebooks, and then there's tabulae, which are documentary, legal, and archival tablets, which we also assume to be waxed wood. Some of them are more large format. Some of them are also hinged like the notebooks, but they're hinged in ways that allow them to be sealed, okay? We have some other terms for these, pugilares, so this word means handhelds, which often stands in for tabelli, or, and then we have codicili, which is the diminutive of the word codex, which seems to be small handheld tablets serving a documentary function. So the emperor issues a small, there's a statement from the emperor, or there's a new thing that you attach to a contract, a codicil, right? Comes from codicilli. Okay. On the right, all of these line drawings are taken from Hella Eckert's book, just to gesture to the material assemblage of the Roman tablet. This is a piece of equipment that is necessary if you have a lot of tablets. It's a spatula for wiping clean an entire tablet at once. This is another fresco from Herculaneum Pompeii. This is in the center here is a capsa, knapsack full of scrolls. You can see they all have little title tags sticking out. Leaning up against it is a documentary tablet. All right, it's a tablet that contains a legal contract. You can see that the writing runs perpendicular. So this contract, inside is the actual full terms of the contract. Outside, written in ink on wood, is a summary of the terms of the contract and the names of the parties to the contract. And then running across the middle is a space for sealing it. You can wrap a cord around it and people can put wax seals with signets across the outside. This is also a hinged bound wax wooden tablet. Completely different function than the drafting of notes or letters. Here's Elizabeth Meyer's reconstruction of how these things work. So it's a diptych, waxed diptych interior, and then painted wood that you can write sort of indelibly on the outside. The idea is if there's ever an argument about the terms of the contract, you can take it into court and break the seals, and everyone can look forensically at the original document on the inside. But I just want to gesture in passing to the fact that in other parts of the Roman world, we see people doing things differently. So in Egypt, people do a lot of their record keeping on papyrus. They also do record keeping just straight ink on wood. And actually, we also see ink on wood all over the Roman Empire. Ink on wood leaves are found all through Northern Europe. England in particular has generated a lot of these. So I just want to bear in mind the kind of non-erasable wooden tablet on which you write in ink. Here are just some images of the maybe larger format archival tablets. This is stuff I encountered when I was working on Roman book burning. And over on the right is the coins that show the burning of documents. It's good, by the way, that these documents are being burned because they contain records of people's unpaid taxes, and the state is forgiving their tax debts. So on the right, it just looks like a pile of squiggles. I'm not sure if I think those are meant to look like tablets or paper, but on the left are these two incredible reliefs, unmistakably showing, carrying on the top, sort of handfuls of these large archival waxed wooden tablets, and the bottom boxfuls. I'm obsessed with the box the guy has on his back. And the bottom, that's a technology I want to know more about. The box for holding all the tablets. So just to give you a sense of what these things look like, I am not sure yet to what extent I think the size on the top image here is being exaggerated for the conventions of a relief. But it's clear that there's a visual language here of archival documents that look like this. You can tell they're waxed wooden tablets because they have a bezel, right? They have an outline. around them, okay? Why do they use wax wood for archival storage? Wax, the Romans understand wax to be permanent. We tend to think of this technology as using wax because it can be easily altered, but the Romans think of wax as being a permanent medium. It has the potential to record traces of tampering, right? And so this is what I want to show you this example of. What's interesting here is that the literary wax tablet is a site of revision and emendation. So we tend to think of wax as a site for ephemera because you can alter it, right? But the documentary wax tablet is one that you cannot alter without leaving a trace. So that's its value for archival documents. So I'm going to just take you briefly through this anecdote from Cicero's Verines. He's describing, this is his investigation of the malfeasance of a governor of Sicily called Gaius Verres, and he's found some documents, he says, that show that the tax company was making illicit payments to Verres. And then so he has to describe the evidence he found in the archive on Sicily, but he says the rules prohibit him from taking the documents back to Rome. So he has a particular challenge that I want to look at. This is a very long, there's like a bunch of text on these slides. I'm so sorry. I'm going to summarize the story. He says he's looking at the tablets and he finds some payments to someone called Gaius Verrucius. And he says, up through the second R in the name Verrucius, the letters were written fine. But then the rest of the name, the ucio part, was written over an erasure. So line after line where the name had apparently been corrected. Okay. And so I went and I asked this guy Carpanacius, who was in charge of the archive, who Verrucius was, and he started sweating. And I couldn't bring the documents back to Rome, so here's what I did. I dragged him in front of a magistrate, and I said, tell me who Verrucius is. And everyone says, there's never been anyone here called Verrucius. And I say, tell me why the slave who kept these archives always messed up the name and always had to correct it in exactly the same way. This is my attempt to reconstruct what it looks like. Okay. And the guy is totally overwhelmed. And Cicero says, so I brought in a bunch of like local grandees and some scribes, and I made a facsimile of the tablets. Every letter and erasure transferred, reproduced exactly into books, into papyrus scrolls. And then all these guys sign off on the veracity of the facsimile. And then this is the turn in the courtroom moment. He says, I have the facsimile right here. Ladies and gentlemen, just gentlemen of the jury, take a look at the facsimile. Here's what it looks like. And then he has this great pun because Verres also means a boar. So he's like, look, do you see how the first part of the name is okay? And then the second part of the name is like a tail. The letters are in the erasure like a pig's tail in the mud. And the point is that the payments all originally said payment to Verres, payment to Verres, payment to Verres, and they've been adjusted to say payment to Verrucius. Okay. So this is just an example of the way that this would only be possible because of wax. This is a very specific dependence on the affordances of wax. You can erase it, but not without leaving a trace of what you've done. And a big question for me is, what did it look like to make a facsimile of this in ink on papyrus? But he's going into great detail to explain this and to tell you that the facsimile is accurate precisely because he doesn't actually have the documents in front of him. This litura, this erasure, is I think a kind of an interesting phenomenon. It can be, it's a word for both the smeared erasure of wax and also the blotting and smearing of ink when you try to erase it or when it runs on papyrus. So there is this word smear that describes both things that happen in wax and things that happen in ink. I've collected here some other just examples of this idea of erasure and smearing. There's a stylus here. There's lots of discussion in Latin about flipping the stylus around to use the flat end to make an erasure. So a stylus has a flat spatula end that's approximately the height of a typical line of text. And you can just use it to erase a line, like the eraser on a pencil. So we have on the one hand this idea of flipping your stylus, which is exclusive to writing in wax, but then this idea of the smear, which cuts across media. So wax is permanent, but it's also sensitive to impressions, okay? And wax has these archival affordances that actually, I think, don't survive remediation easily. In other words, this is what I'm talking about with the difficulty of creating a facsimile that describes what Cicero says he saw. And so I just want to sort of stress here, I mean, I'm not the first person to observe what's going on in this scene, but stress here how much this complicates our assumptions about a literary use of the erasable wax tablet for making a draft, where we think of wax as being primarily a medium that's useful because you can emend it, or you can wipe the thing clean when you're done with your draft. It's completely different use of wax. We'll turn now to the satirist Perseus. And I wish my friend Kate Mangbrassel were here, because she's the person I learned everything I know about Perseus from, but I also am glad she's not here because it means she's in Rome, which is also a good place to be. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I had invited her before I remembered that she's on the other side of the world. So parchment. Parchment is the thing I've become obsessed with. Parchment is the medium in waiting for the Mediterranean book. The Romans just like can't seem to get their act together and realize that parchment is the superior writing surface. Parchment is entangled in our evidence and our histories with the adoption of the codex. Lots of arguments about whether, when Marshall describes a book on parchment, is he necessarily describing a codex? Can you have the codex without parchment? Yes, you can, but papyrus has kind of different features in this regard. People will say things like, well, the Romans used papyrus instead of parchment, or the medieval innovation was the adoption of parchment. And indeed, when Roman literature talks about Roman literature, Roman poets, with the exception of Martial, only talk about books being written on papyrus. And then the best material record we have, aside from the Villa dei Papiri in Italy, is Egypt, where everything is written on papyrus, basically. So parchment is this thing that's kind of on the outside. It's on the edges. We don't think about it as being a mainstream Roman writing material. And I want to think about how that might not be the case. So Perseus has this poem where he wakes up with a hangover and sits down to write poetry. And he's like looking for someone to bring him his stuff, and no one's there, and he feels like he's going to throw up, and his head is splitting, and he reaches for his writing equipment. And this is a really interesting little bit of text, because it describes apparently a complete assemblage of Roman literate activity that does not look like the picture we get from people like Catullus, where you have like a wax tablet for drafting and then a finished papyrus book roll. He says, okay, now I'm getting my book and my two-toned parchment and a sheet of papyrus and a reed, and now I'm trying to get the ratio right of water to cuttlefish ink to write with. You ask the ink people what Romans wrote with, and they'll say carbon-based ink until about the 3rd or 4th century, and then iron gall ink. I haven't found anyone who takes seriously this claim that he's using cuttlefish ink. It's possible that the word for cuttlefish ink here is kind of metonymic for carbon-based ink. I would like someone to tell me how many cuttlefish the city of Rome went through in a day, because then I think we could start to reconstruct the viability of using cuttlefish ink for writing. But anyway, what is this assemblage? There's a book, and a book, that means scroll. Okay. Then there's this two-toned parchment. I want to come back to that. There's a sheet of papyrus. There's a reed pen, and there's this dilute cuttlefish ink. So if we try to map what these are, the book, that seems like what he's reading, maybe his like source material or inspiration. And then maybe the sheet of papyrus is for like a finished product or a finished draft. So what's this parchment for? And why is it two-toned? To shed some light on this, we can go a century later. The poet Martial has a book of poems that are like Saturnalia presents, and he does a couplet of poetry describing each one. And it starts with a bunch of writing materials, and he's giving people different kinds of tablets for Saturnalia. And so he gives people tablets made of citrus wood, which is fancy, and 5-leaved ones, which he seems to suggest are kind of a little more mundane, documentary. And he has ivory notebooks. And he says that ivory makes for a great notebook because it's high contrast. Black ink on white ivory is easy to read, unlike wax, which is hard to read. And then he says, I've also got notebooks made of parchment. He says, you can imagine that it's wax. You'll think it's wax because of how erasable it is. That's the pitch for parchment as a writing material. Okay. This is, again, nothing like the sort of big picture narrative we have where the inevitability of parchment is as a thing for writing permanent books on. Those of you who've worked with parchment know that actually ink does not like to stay on parchment necessarily, depending on how the parchment is prepared and what kind of ink it is, right? The orator Quintilian says it's best to write on wax because that's easiest to erase, But if your eyes are not so good, and many Romans' eyes would not have been so good, then parchment is better, again, because it's high contrast. And he doesn't say parchment is not erasable. It's just a little less erasable. It's a little more pain in the ass to erase than wax. That's probably because you have to use water. So actually, it seems like Romans have a pretty clear understanding that parchment is an erasable medium and a viable erasable medium for drafting in notebook form. In fact, Horace, a century earlier, Horace uses a parchment notebook, apparently a shorthand for work in progress. Okay, you do all this work in your parchment notebooks and then put them away in the closet for a while. Okay. So parchment notebooks seem to be well known from a pretty early date relative to kind of the big flowering of Roman literature. It's got erasability. This erasability depends on the water solubility of carbon-based ink. Okay, that's what makes parchment erasable. It's also got this affordance of high contrast visibility, which I think is super interesting and important. I want to just speculate on why Perseus's parchment is two-toned, and he calls it two-color, bicolor, and the conventional reading is hair side and flesh side. And I think that's possible. I mean, I've looked at parchment, but we know that Romans have a strong understanding of the visual language and conventions of a tablet, an erasable tablet for notebook work. And those visual conventions include a bezel. I want to just speculate that it might be possible that not unlike the early modern tablets where paper is treated for erasability, that they were doing something to the parchment to enhance its erasability, and that they were laying it out like a phone screen with a bezel around it. In other words, that they were treating almost all the parchment to make it erasable and leaving a bezel, and that those look like two different colors. So that so in other words, it's possible that the parchment is two-colored because of different sides. It's also possible that it's been treated with something, and so that when you look at one piece of parchment, it's two-colored. I have no evidence for this, just speculating. I just want to also note a few other uses of parchment that I think are telling and interesting. In the 2nd century, Aldus Gellius tells a story about going to his friend Fronto's house, and Fronto is sitting there with his feet up because his gout is acting up, and he's got these contractors there who he's brought in to build him some new baths, and the contractors are showing him different bathhouses they might build. And these are described as being depictas in membranulis. And you can see my question marks here because I'm really actually increasingly unsure how to translate this. I think it means they're painted on sheets of parchment. I think that the diminutive form here is, this is like parchment that you would get in a notebook, but it's separated out into individual leaves. And I think painted is usually what depictas means, but it also could mean just like illustrated. So I'm basically just unsure about paint. I don't know if I think this is painted. But I'm also not sure if this is like pretty pictures, like concept art of what it looks like when it's done, or what we would think of as something like blueprints. And the reason I'm raising this question is because what this gestures to, I think, is a whole other unwitnessed and undescribed set of uses for parchment in what we might think of as the craft and artisanal sphere. That actually these affordances of parchment around erasability, for example, that make them useful for notebooks for the kind of hyperliterate super elite, I think immediately open up the possibility that they have all kinds of interesting uses for people who are like making plans and making drawing diagrams and have to transmit diagrams and things to one another. So I just want to I think that this is like maybe a little glimpse of an even larger world of Roman parchment usage, which we should just say is like not going to survive in the material record at all. Right? So I want to suggest that there's a lot of Roman usage of parchment that only gets brief passing mention in the literary record and doesn't survive anywhere in the material record, with the exception that like a lot of the documents from Dura Europos are on parchment. So actually, this is the one place that's not a total extremity in the Roman Empire where we have a lot of materials is Dura Europos, and there does seem to be a lot of parchment from there. So that suggests to me that maybe we're missing parchment. The thing that makes me think about this is the inkwells. And these are just some of the most interesting charts from Hella Eckert's book. I love this one with the burial showing where the inkwells are most likely to be placed relative to the skeleton, the burial. I don't know what that means. I similarly don't know what the deposit tendencies mean in these two bar graphs on the right. But what's interesting to me is that there is a lot of stuff in this book about deposits of complete sets of writing. Complete set of writing equipment usually means something like an inkwell, a pen, and a stylus, so that you can be using the whole chain. But there's a lot of evidence of deposits of just inkwells and pens. Does that mean that those people aren't doing tablet work, or does it mean that they're doing their tablet work in ink on something like parchment or wood? You see what I'm getting at? We typically think that the stylus is the stand-in for tablet work because we associate the stylus with wax wood. And I just think, like, the more I think about parchment as a notebook medium, the more I think that there's probably a lot of tablet work going on that's just ink, tip to tail, if that makes sense. Okay. I just want to flag that if you go to the Met, if you go up to the teaching collections on the second floor above the Greek and Roman stuff, you'll see these two objects in a case. And if you go look them up on the Met website, they will tell you that these are both Roman styluses. That one on the left has to be a pen. Now, again, the Roman literary record only ever talks about pens as being made of reeds. This is clearly an iron pen, which is super interesting. So then ways we can start rethinking parchment and the Roman book actually begin to crack open. Instead of asking, like, when did the codex get adopted and how is parchment related to the adoption of codex, we could ask just when and how were Romans using parchment? Like, what was the role of the place of parchment as a writing surface in the Roman world? I think that, it's interesting to think that we might have kind of these parchment notebooks, parchment bifolia as erasable notebooks, leading more or less directly into the parchment choir. We tend to want to insist on a space in this for papyrus because that's what the material record from Egypt shows. But Egypt is where it's easiest to get papyrus. Okay, and so this is where we get into the question of biomes. The thing that we really have to grapple with if we're going to generalize and typologize Roman writing across the whole span of the empire is that different materials are accessible in different proportions in different places in the empire. It's why none of the Vindolanda tablets are on papyrus. Vindolanda being the site on the Hadrian's Wall, where we have anaerobic bog conditions that preserve all kinds of Roman writing on wood. Other sites, especially in London, have also given more of this writing on wood. Interestingly, the Roman writing directly on wood leaves, it seems to be bark or shavings. It seems like they're waxing the wood to make it hold the ink better, which is interesting. They're not waxing it for erasure, but these tablets do have traces of wax on them that suggest that there's a preparation process in there. Once we start thinking in those regards, like the proportion of papyrus plants to trees is different in Vindolanda than it is in Oxyrhynchus. We also think about the fact that anywhere in the Roman Empire, any human settlement is churning through animals, right, at a pretty steady clip, and they're already curing and treating skins for leather, and it's not that much more work to, relatively speaking, to generate parchment from that as well. So this is my sort of like very speculative, you're going to go away and say I'm crazy, like broad gesture to the possibility that we are vastly underestimating Roman uses of parchment as a writing material. So what are tablets? Notebooks are erasable for purposes of revision or reuse. Erasable notebooks can be made of waxed wood and you write on them with a stylus, or they can be made of parchment or ivory and you write on them with ink. So we have these writing supports that are capable of erasure, and those lend themselves to notebook usage. So ink is not necessarily a permanent writing material. That's something important to think about. Last one, Numerius's tablet. So here I'm going to kind of flip perpendicular, if you like. The tablet is typically associated with intermediacy. It's an intermediate stage on the way to a final draft. Historically, it's the intermediate stage to the development of the codex. I want to talk about just very briefly here is the way the tablet is also an intermediary between gradations of status and power in multi-party literate acts. What am I talking about? Lucky Marcus Numerius was so beloved by his wife that she set up this nice memorial stone for him, and we know nothing else about him. He's got it seems like, his dad seems to have a normal Roman name. He dies out here in what is today the border between Turkey and Greece. This is not I might even show this last time I was here, this image. I'm kind of obsessed with it. Not a particularly what's the polite way of putting this? This is not a high artisanal quality gravestone. I'm not trying to kind of, you know, put it down or anything. I should note that the face is added later, as are the creepy little fingers. It's a simple image that nonetheless conveys a clear visual language. Who was Marcus Numerius? He was a guy who had an assistant or slave with him, helping him handle documents, right? Because what we see here is this little person, and little human figures next to big human figures generally signify lower social status. He's handing off to Numerius a multi-leaf notebook. You can actually see the different leaves, I think. And he's holding a stylus. The stylus has been like exaggerated so that you can't miss that it's a stylus. It has a pointy end and a flat end. Okay. So what I'm interested in here is what the tablet signifies about Numerius. What is this visual language? Just a little bit from Apuleius talking about, he's talking about basically how closely people listen to his speeches and then write them down and publish them, and he can't get away with making any mistakes. And he has the comparison of the proconsul and the proconsul's herald. So the herald gets up and walks around bellowing at the top of his voice, but the proconsul speaks in a controlled voice, sitting down, reading from a tablet. It's the herald's job to talk loudly, but the proconsul's tablet is his judgment, and it cannot be increased or diminished by a single letter once it has been read out and is then entered into the records of the province as soon as it has been recited. And what he's getting at here is this immutability of certain kinds of text that have to pass through the format of tablet, but also have to pass through this kind of multi-party act of declaring the judgment, right? And then it has this instantiation on the tablet and gets entered into the archive. And so the tablet here is yes, but in the middle of processes of remediation, but it's also in the middle of a very distinct power gradient and a ceremonial act. The ceremonial, the tablet is kind of the ceremony in a sense. You know, we might compare this to this little glimpse we get at the end of Horace's first book of satires. He's just done this long poem, and then the last line of the poem is suddenly he addresses a slave who's been in the room the whole time. He says, "Go and quickly add these lines to my book." And this raises all sorts of questions, I think, for us. Has this slave been taking dictation the whole time? Like, who's been holding the tablet, right? Or do we imagine that Horace has been writing the poem and then he hands it off to the slave who's going to take it off and give it to the scribe who's going to copy into the book? Or is the slave himself also the scribe? Not clear, but we can see that there's a kind of transfer moment here, right? And the draft has to do that work. What else does it mean that tablets and writing material are at these gradients and interfaces? Well, Galen talks about the specific kinds of injuries that result from powerful men getting mad at the slaves around them and lashing out with the most convenient sharp object to hand, which is a writing implement. So he talks about stabbing people with styluses, putting people's eyes out with pens and styluses. This is a reminder that anything that's situated at the most extreme power gradient in the Roman world between master and slave is potentially implicated in like really real violence. You know, there's an anecdote about Domitian that he would sit in his room all day and use his writing stylus to kill flies. This is real like psycho behavior. Okay, so just again a glimpse of the way that once we situate this writing equipment at this interface, its potential for violence suddenly leaps out. This is like maybe an unanticipated affordance of this stuff. So I just want to think about the way that the tablet can be a focal lens to register status, power, and labor as components of Roman literacy, the way that the Romans practiced literacy. Writing moves between parties in these multi-party literate acts, whether it's like the delivery of a judgment or the completion of a literary work. These multi-party literate acts are built around these gradients of skill and power, and sometimes the gradient of skill and power run opposite to each other. So, right, the master depends on a slave who knows how to do shorthand or calligraphy or something like that. And the tablet, I think, it can be a focal point for looking at like how specifically are these gradients present and how do they work. So to conclude, what can we say about Roman writing materials and the uses to which Romans put them? I wish I had found a way to illustrate this as a circle. Papyrus is used for archival storage sometimes, okay? But wax wood is also used for archival storage. But wax wood is also used for reusable notebooks. But parchment is also used for reusable notebooks. But parchment is also used for finished books. But papyrus is also used for finished books, right? So we have a set of overlapping use cases that take advantage of different affordances of the same materials. Sometimes when they're situated in different forms, something like that. And I haven't, it's a much more kind of complicated, and you would worry about my mental state if you saw the full diagram where I've like got the red yarn and I'm trying to adumbrate all the media and all the use cases and get ostraca in there and wooden leaves in there. We get bronze diplomas in there. We got to get lead and curse tablets in there. We got to get wood. We got to get stone. Okay. But the two basic modalities of Roman writing, inscribing something soft and applying ink to a surface, I think from these two modalities proliferate a kind of surprising set of relationships between material and use case. So we can classify Roman writing materials by their application to different use cases. And these use cases, I think, should be first distinguished by their need for permanence versus erasability. I'm going to suggest that that should be our starting point for categorizing Roman writing materials. There's no one support form or assemblage that we can associate exclusively with any one use case. And as a result of trying to associate materials totally with use cases, we've probably been missing materials whose affordances meet the needs of certain practices. This is what I'm getting at with parchment in particular. I want to close by gesturing quickly again to the problem I flagged at the beginning of the problem of the literary. What is it that literary literacy obscures for us? So we saw in the end there that the writing implement is a weapon. Okay. And we've also seen how reading literate equipment in the right way and literary sources can reveal labor configurations and power dynamics. And I think I've also gestured to the way that an over-reliance on the literary can obscure the totality of Roman writing in the record. I want to suggest that we might start to think about this obscurity as something intentional. Historians of slavery talk about the violence of the archive, the way that the people who have the power to create records and documents inscribe in those records and documents the power dynamics of the world around them, and perpetuate the violence that they practice against people, against those people as they're recorded in documents and archives. So I wonder if it's possible to say that the literary tablet has this kind of overemphasized image of authorial work in Roman literature is actually there partly to obscure questions like labor, like who's actually doing the work. So the image of the poet sitting alone holding his tablet doesn't seem to correspond to a lot of other evidence we have for how Romans do writing. And I want to suggest that we might actually think about the image, the poetic image of the literary tablet, as something like the writing in the erasure. It's the thing that's there over an obfuscation, over a kind of obscurance. And the thing that's obscured are some of these power and labor dynamics that I was gesturing to right at the end there. Thank you.
Okay, so Joe Farrell had the 3-word invite Joe Howley. I have the 1-word wow. that was fabulous. And I'm sure there are loads of questions. One from Ralph Rose.
Joe.
Hey, Ralph.
Hey, great talk.
Thank you.
And lots of questions, but I'll start with one that I think your one Galen slide got me thinking about this because I think it's the only one that is in Greek.
Yeah.
And so the question is a couple of simple one, which is so as you well know, because we talked about it, that's Galen too writes a lot about implements.
Yeah.
So does it help? Is it similar period you're talking about? Does the Greek terminology help or hinder some of the research?
Yeah.
Let me just ask the one specific question for you, because now I'm thinking of it. when he uses in on avoiding distress, he talks about these recipes.
Yeah.
That I think I'm not garbling it on leather. Well, the Greek word is translated as leather.
Yeah.
And it's, I don't know if it's unparalleled in Greek, but it's weird. You know? And it's people often say, as you were kind of trying to debunk earlier, well, you know, that these would have been used only for sort of recipes, which are kind of and kind of catalogs. Is it, I mean, it's possible that leather, that word is referring to what you're talking about. Using parchment.
I think it is. And I think that if I give this talk again, I should have that passage up here because I think it's a great example of this in Greek.
Yeah.
That there are lots of really attractive use cases for parchment and parchment notebooks in the Roman world. And the only reason that seems weird is that that's not what you do for literary texts.
Right.
So, right. And so this comes back to the argument about why is it that Marshall, at the beginning of his book of poems, first book of poems, makes a big deal about the idea of his poetry being on parchment. And some people want to say that this is brand new, right? And I think I'm not sure I have an opinion on whether it's brand new to have published finished literature on parchment per se. But I think it is probably the case that, you know, what's weird is that this is a notebook format. I think in other words, I think that parchment is common and there is a strong association with it. And Galen saying that would not have been strange to anyone. He's just specifying the form that it was in. As for Greek evidence generally, the one reason that there was not a lot of Greek in this talk is that I think that the Greek vocabulary is much less clear and has been the next stage of this project for me is to go back through the Greek vocabulary as it goes from the archaic to the classical to the Roman period and really try to reinterrogate our assumptions about what these words mean at any given time. But this is, you know, I started with the Panakiptukto in Homer, right? And even in the Scholiasts to Homer, they're arguing about what those words mean and which media what that actually corresponds to. So I think that, you know, in some Greek has both the misfortune but also the potential advantage for us of being continuously used over an extraordinarily long time period that saw many different changes in writing practices. So that for me is kind of the next frontier. Yeah. Thank you. Davida.
Thank you. It's just fascinating talk. I want to go to the comment that you made about the bicolored parchment. I think it might have to do with the quality of the parchment.
Okay.
I use, you know, I read Torah in the synagogue, and so I've seen a lot of Torah scrolls which are made on parchment, and there are some where just the skin itself has more than one color. Of course. And that might mean that it was cheaper. And there's also a practice of if it's really cheap or it has a lot of blotches on it, they would put some form of whitewash over it, and sometimes on both sides. But why you would want to whitewash the back doesn't make any sense. But it makes a difference in the transportability of whether you can pick the scroll up or not. It's not, you can roll it, there's no problem with rolling it. But I think transportability is another affordance that we want to look into, because parchment can't be written on outside or in the rain or you know, things like that.
Thank you. That's great. I think that makes a lot of sense. And also, I think we then might wonder if you know, the skins that have sort of very consistent coloration are reserved for other uses. And so you might only get the kind of splotchy skins for your notebook cases where the aesthetics don't really matter.
Or just for people who can't afford them.
Right. So that maybe bicolor is letting us into some of the gradations of cost and quality level for parchment. That's fantastic. Thank you. I think, yeah, portability is something that I didn't talk a lot about. There's an anecdote about Pliny the Elder, how he like never stops working, and even when he's being carried around in his sedan chair, he has a slave next to him with a notebook, and seems to suggest wax tablet. And there's a detail about how he makes sure the slave wears mittens so that he can keep writing in the cold. But this isn't making me think about like waxed wood works in the rain, right? The ink stuff doesn't work in the rain, right? So this is then, and you know, a certain sizable proportion of this Roman literate activity that we see attested across the empire is like military administration. You know, the frontier is like very different from, you know, a city house. So this is great. Thank you. I'm going to have to think about portability. I'm going to have to think about climatic conditions. Fantastic.
Okay, we want to stop sharing your screen.
Sure. Stop share. Great.
There we go.
Okay.
Ann Cutner, and then Whitney.
Thank you.
Ann.
Wonderful. You know, I remember your labor talk in the work-life conference. I was sort of going to talk too about surfaces, and you talked about affordances, right? Which is one of my favorite words. And something to think about is that every time you see papyrus, probably every time you see parchment, you see furniture. You need a table.
Mm-hmm.
And for table,
Mhm.
and they're going to be steps.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very interesting images of people being able to write in a tablet something stiff while they're standing up.
Right.
And you can see it on the diptych of Provenance.
Right.
And it's very much like what Pliny's slave is doing in the litter, this poor unfortunate person squished in a corner. Something you can do sitting up, you know, and so it gives you the very curious status of the document, which we think of as a sort of perdurable thing, but if you catch a moment, you kind of need to kind of a second job. So while you're talking, somebody can be scribbling.
Exactly.
Somebody can be jotting it down in the audience. Images of doing something like this.
Right.
And so those affordances get very interesting. Reading also, there's that image from what other people talk about a curious thing you can put in your lap. It's like a wooden tray for reading scrolls.
Bookbinders.
So that you can get away from the table and desk.
Yeah.
You kind of have this thing, but just sort of telling you this is where affordances kind of
Great.
That's useful.
Thank you. Yeah, and that immediately makes me think of I've read a little bit about attempts to reconstruct the furniture of scribal writing on papyrus in Egypt, and like I guess there's stuff as far back as the pharaonic visual evidence of a particular way of sitting that you can stretch your skirt across your knees to create a flat surface for papyrus, but that seems to be very specifically Egyptian. I think you're absolutely right that this is a particular dimension of portability, which is kind of like that you can not only can you transport it, but you can use it without any furniture. I think that makes a lot of sense. The one of the sort of next things that I want to get into here is that when we look at the tablets that survive, you know, a lot of them are like this. We might think of sort of handheld size, pugilars, but then a lot of them, as you probably know, are like small. There's like these really little, intimate, like ivory ones, you know, and Marshall even jokes about, you know, like these are the ones that your girlfriend keeps in her dress. And these are the ones that you like can sneak a note with. And I think, you know, this then takes me back to what is the parchment notebook? Well, the parchment notebook, you can't use it for dictation, right? Even though, well, so this is then where, I mean, Quintilian gets into the different affordances for fast writing. So we would have to sort of coordinate like portable writing and sort of ad hoc furnitureless writing with sort of stenography. Stenographic writing has particular needs. And when I try to write in wax, I find it very laborious and slow. But the thing that would slow you down if you were trying to do it in ink is that you have to re-ink the pen. And so it seems like for stenography, the wax is preferred. Although if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if we have evidence for this. I know we have medieval evidence for this. I don't remember if we have any Roman evidence for belt-mounted inkwells, which I think is a thing.
Make it sound like you're trying to test yourself by sitting in a lecture with a wax tablet.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you. And that's a lot of really helpful stuff.
Okay, Whitney and then Peter.
And there's some in the chat. Or not in the chat, raising their hand.
Okay, well, we'll get to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is would be rude to ask a question for trained, so my apologies in advance. But it strikes me that you're kind of setting up the question here in terms of our focus on the literary has obscured some of what we might otherwise understand about tablets. But you're also just talking about how an evolutionary model of media is so destructive to our understanding how like actual practices proliferate in a culture in relation to the biome or the materials available to them, right? And which is something really familiar from media archaeology. And this is just kind of a comment, but what you're making me think is that so much of the weight in book history has been on the birth of the codex and the origins of the codex, and then we kind of reverse engineer the codex in something like the wax tablet and say this is kind of a proto-codex. But if these pupillaries membranae or whatever, like if they're being folded, then they would have had to have some kind of bifolio that would have required the kind of thing that we call format when you get to the codex, which would have required that weird relationship of like page 2 next to page 7 or whatever, which I've always thought of as the actual innovation of the codex, right? That you're not going from page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, but that you actually have to think in this kind of nonlinear way about the structure of the book. And Peter's done a lot of great work on linearity reading in the codex, but like the actual physical material structure of the codex, right? So I'm just like, it's more of a comment, but I'm just really interested in how more even than affordance, like if we just cut off the codex and think in terms of the birth of format instead, we might tell like what you're doing here might tell a different story about the relationship between like pages and material structure like that.
So I immediately think of this great book that I should have put on my citation slide by Boudalis, The Birth of the Codex, which is a really detailed and specific situation of codices in the context of craft, particularly in Egypt and the vicinity. The page that always stands out for me is the one where he shows a head stitching of a binding of an ancient codex, and then he shows a curtain made with the same stitching structure. But I'm trying to take seriously your suggestion that we cut off the codex and not think about that as our telos. And the place I go to then is the predominance in the visual, like the visual records of from these frescoes from Pompeii that show people holding and using tablets. They're almost always multi-leaved tablets, these like quinquepliques. And that is an interesting format question for me, because when you're making multi-leaved tablets, you just add pages. But when you make a quire, you get the format phenomenon you're talking about. And so I don't feel like I have the evidence yet to say, like, how many leaves does a parchment notebook have? But it seems to me that it would be very tempting to start making quires. And then you're really not far from a multi-quire codex, right? But then there are questions here about, I don't know, like storage of those things and how they get bound. And now I'm uncomfortable because I feel like I'm in the realm of imagining an object that is nowhere attested in the material record, but seems to be strongly suggested by all this evidence.
No physical parchment, the pupillaries, like physical folded pieces.
I haven't been through everything from Dura Europos, and so it's possible that we have something there. But I don't think we have, I have never seen a picture of something someone has identified with any of this stuff in the literary evidence I was talking about, which suggests that it's possible that there is like a specifically Roman Western European format of parchment notebook that just does not survive in the material record anywhere. Yeah, I guess one way into this would be to start thinking about how much text do people suggest is going into any one set of pupillaries membranae, and what might that suggest to us about format? Yeah, thank you, Woody. That's really great.
Peter, and then we will go to our remote friends.
Thanks for a really wonderful presentation. Just in relationship to storage, I mean, Marina Rostow has done this work on the storage. So when we think of codex, she actually just is looking at very small things folded up but on a string. from, I forget what date she's looking at, very early.
Ganesh stuff, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so Ganesh
Yeah.
materials, but massive amounts. So you can store without a codex, in other words, you actually,
Right.
what she's been looking at is making things smaller as a storage device for
Uh-huh.
permanent records.
Uh-huh.
That the bigger scrolls were actually used for presentation, public presentation. And then the smallest are actually folded up to put on the string.
Mhm.
Like accordion fold.
The question I really was, which I thought you did such wonderful work with this notion of affordances. But what happens if you distinguish between a writing surface and a writing implement?
Mhm.
In other words, there's an affordance to a writing surface, but there's also an affordance to a writing implement.
Huh.
And that when you're talking about parchment, and this goes back to what Davida and what Anne were talking about too, when you talk about the affordances of an artisan, when they're outside, the disadvantage of writing with a pen is not related to the parchment, it's the pen. The pen and ink is difficult.
Yeah.
So what Heather and I are finding is that very explicitly, erasable technologies may have nothing to do with erasability. They may be being used purely because you use a stylus.
Uh-huh.
In other words, we're finding them on board ships.
Dry point is just easier.
Yeah, so it's just so that you can write on board a ship with a stylus.
Great.
And this is what the East India Company is doing in the 17th, 18th century. They're doing it. They're writing with a stylus on an erasable notebook because you don't want to use on board a ship pen and ink.
Right.
So it's got nothing to do with the writing surface.
Right, yeah.
So I do think here you're back to a different kind of question, which is that I think the crucial step that you're making, which is so important, is that wax is absolutely a potentially permanent surface. And that's obviously clear. That for Roman laws, and that's about sealing. You can actually, it's all about the sealing technique.
Yeah.
The wax doesn't decay, but it's really a sealing practice. And the crucial thing is the groove in the middle.
Yeah.
And then it's the actual, but wax is being used also on the string to actually seal the.
Yeah.
So if you break the seal, the legal status disappears. So it seems to me that affordance is, once you start with the notion of the wax tablet, which has been enshrined in Roman literature as the notion of what Ovid writes on, what the great writer writes on. If you change your focus from the work we've been doing on writing tables, they've got nothing to do with literary practice. And we hoped they would do. We hoped they'd find the secret to Shakespeare or something. But no, what it basically is mercantile.
Yes.
And it's always related to writing outside.
Yeah.
And that Montaigne says the same thing. Roger Chartier has written about this, where, when Montaigne goes outside, he takes with him writing tablets and a stylus.
Yeah.
Same with Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney says he does actually compose the Arcadia on horseback at some point, but writing, but using a stylus. You couldn't use, but the vast majority of stuff we're looking at is first of all about numbers. What we find written in these things is far more of numbers than, they're not merely writing at all. It's mainly, it's vast amounts of sums, records of objects, sometimes the words are often, anyway, so I'm sorry, I'm saying far too much.
No.
But the importance is, it seems to me the crucial thing is to keep clear the writing surface and the writing implement.
That's great.
And you can often write on the same surface, including on the erasable tablets we work on with any implement. You can write with graphite, you can write with ink, you can write with a stylus.
Yeah.
The difference there is what implement you use because of the situation you're in.
Mm-hmm.
And the crucial situation that we're finding is above all actually on board ships and traveling,
Thank you. That's great. I thought I would pull up here. You want numbers. I mean, that's what this is, an account book here from Dr. Oasis, and it's just leaf after leaf of numbers. And this I didn't include the very famous portraits of like the woman holding her tablets or the woman holding the stylus against her lips, which I think none of that is about is about literary literacy. I mean, I think even this is documentary stuff here. Like this is about managing accounts and stuff. And you know, this is so to get back to the sort of the question of like, what has the literary done? You know, this the literary is a proportional, like it's a tiny fraction of literate practice and culture, right? Ink has to be kept stable, its humidity has to be managed, right? The mix has to be maintained. And so then what this makes me think about is that in the Roman context, there are certain kinds of documents that have to be produced in ink at the very end of a kind of chaîne à portoir or like remediation cycle, you know? And so like all these inkwells in the archaeological record that we associate with scribes and all sorts of different places, that ink work is for producing certain kinds of things in controlled conditions that will be kept in controlled conditions. It's striking to me, one of the things I didn't talk about is the bronze diplomata that the Roman army generates. When you're discharged from the Roman army, you get your paperwork inscribed on a little folded bit of bronze, not unlike the folded lead tablets that we see in lots of places. And I don't know, you're making me think now about like, maybe the army has a strong preference for styluses and you know, dry point and this kind of thing, precisely because they're working in much more variable conditions. So thank you. That's great. This has added a new dimension to how I'm going to think about affordance. Thank you.
Okay, stop sharing.
Or stop sharing, Maris.
I think we have 2 questions from the audience. So
We need to call on the first one.
yes, the first.
Do I do that?
Brigitte.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. And I was especially struck by your conclusion about the obfuscation of labor. And I wondered whether you'd be willing at some point to return to this, expand perhaps a little bit. For now, I would like to share the perspective from a medievalist, if you would. And maybe I have 3 types of comments and questions to make. The first one was inspired by your slides on frontos contractors and the use of the term painting to allude to images or letters that had been put on the parchment. And that made me realize that one way of thinking about the affordances of parchment versus wax is a type of writing that they also call for. In wax, you incise. The type of writing is much closer to epigraphy. And of course, in parchment, you paint. And certainly in the medieval period, this idea of painting text was metaphorically very significant. So I just wondered whether you have echoes of these different form of, and here, of course, I'm talking about the gesture of writing as they related to these supports. With respect to the erasure afforded by wax as well as by parchment, we have an interesting text in the 12th century by Richard Fitz-Neal in his dialogue of the Exchequer, in which he recommends that documents be written on sheepskin. He's well aware that sheepskin is cheap, but when you erase from it, it becomes very visible, and therefore forgeries are more easily detected. So I was struck by the parallel with which you indicated to us as well. And finally, I don't know if it's a question, but medieval scribes and in medieval culture in general, particularly I would say in the Central Middle Ages, is very sensitive to the animal quality of parchment. And there are, you know, grandiose discussions about vegetal supports for handwriting, such as papyrus, and animal supports like wax but particularly the skin of the animal. And I just wondered if there was anything similar in antiquity. That is this metaphorical interaction between the written, the text, and its support.
Great. Thank you so much. I would love to, if it's all right, follow up with you to get the citation about the sheepskin, because that sounds really helpful. And you know, this has made me think a lot more about the transition between carbon to gall, iron gall ink, the so-called mordant inks, right? That the carbon ink that's widespread in Roman antiquity is much more erasable because water soluble, and the mordant inks They don't last in various ways. They don't last sort of long term sometimes, but they would not have been erasable. And there's a missing component here I didn't address because I don't understand it fully myself, which is what ink does in the vegetable fibers of papyrus, because sometimes it seems like papyrus is pretty erasable, but not permanently erasable. And I passed over my discussion of sponges. There is an idiom of the sponge in Roman literature as a shorthand for erasure, but kind of like regrettable or clumsy erasure of literature in some way. You asked about the incised quality of wax, and I mean I think exactly the same thing, that there is in a full totalizing model of all this stuff, we have to put the incising of wax and the incising of soft metals on some kind of spectrum with the incising of stone.
Definitely.
And in particular, I'll note that although in various local contexts, like in Egypt, the permanent archives are kept in papyrus, but that's Egypt. And I have this kind of Romanesque axe to grind here, which is that God love my papyrological colleagues, but the uniqueness of that biome and that culture, which has had an existing scribal culture for a millennium before the Romans showed up, has completely altered our view of what Roman writing is. And in Egypt, the archives are kept on papyrus, and it does seem like in individual private households, scrolls made sense as the final resting place for archival data. But I think in the West, once you reach a certain level of civic archival retention, it's all incised on wax in archival tablates. And when you get the very highest level of state archiving of, for example, laws, those are incised on bronze and they're mounted on walls. So I actually think I would want to sort of follow that there is a notional apex here of authority, and it is the incised media and not the painted media. You asked about the animal metaphor. I am struggling to think of any examples of this, I'm struggling to think of examples of this that take the form you've alluded to in the medieval context. But what comes to mind for me is something that comes back to the obfuscation of labor, which is sort of my primary interest in all of this. Yes. And it is a collection of anecdotes from the 2nd century CE in the Attic Nights of Aulus Gellius that is a set of anecdotes about cryptography, hidden or secret writing. The primary example is the so-called Caesar cipher, which is a rotational cipher. The other two anecdotes come from Greek historiography. And the first one involves taking a waxed wooden tablet, removing the wax, writing a message in ink on the wood, and reapplying the wax so that the tablet looks blank but has a secret message written under the wax. The second anecdote involves shaving the scalp of a slave, tattooing a message literally on his living skin, letting the hair grow back, and sending him to carry one message, but secretly bearing another message. And I think that this is actually the very Roman version of what you're talking about, is that the metaphor for them would not be the animal to core as an ontological category, but would in fact be the skin of literate labor, which is the thing that's all around them.
You're surely aware of Bruce Holsinger's recent book on parchment, and he has this wonderful story where an official had not done his work well, and he was therefore his skin is flayed. As a punishment, he was flayed. His skin was then made into the official chair in which the son of that poor man had to sit to fulfill the work of his father, with a reminder that he should do it honestly, because all along he was seated on the skin of his father who had delivered these bad documents. So yes, I see your point about the emphasis being on the skin and human skin.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Yeah.
Thank you.
And our final question goes to Jermaine.
Oh, good to me.
Yes.
I know how late it is, and I will not speak for a long time or ask a long question. I have something to contribute. My particular thing is format, not material methods of dealing with it, but I do a lot of reading in that area nonetheless. I thought that your book list was very, very valuable. And I hope to be, I've read almost everything on it, but not all on it. I do have something to add. It's very slightly later. And it's not a book I've seen widely reviewed, but it's Thomas Grauman. Do you know about Thomas Grauman? The Acts of the Early Church Councils, Production and Character. Now, it's very interesting to me because I'm interested in format, and the rigidity of the procedure is astounding. The rigidity of the book is astounding too. Good luck to you to get through it, because it's full of good stuff. This is a little bit late for you, but these procedures are generated very early. They're connected with the sort of things you were talking about. And I've been a little surprised that Grauman hasn't been more widely reviewed or something like that, because it's one hell of a book.
Fantastic. Thank you. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for.
The Early Church Council, Production and Character.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, I would love to go on forever, actually, but we are past time. And so with regret, I will call the end to this session, but also with great gratitude. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we have some.
Yes, we have some beautiful
pseudo tablets.
I want to make sure I saved the check here. Let's see.
It's mostly me trying to.
Oh, you were summarized. Oh, okay.
Someone asked for a summary.
Some iron goings are slow to dry. Great. Okay. Oh, you were summarizing. Okay, great. Then I don't need to. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Great.
And Zoom.
And Zoom.